That's a great question, and it's one I labored over from the very beginning of the book because when I started the book, I felt like I was going to find fault on both sides with the strike.
Hmm.
It was going to be more a kind of everybody, had their deficiencies or their the faults about how things played out. But as the process of researching and writing the book went on, I found myself more and more having sympathy with the strikers. I mean, they certainly did make some poor judgments at times, and that some of these strikers were participating in some acts of violence against
Hmm.
railroad property, like burning bridges
Yeah.
or flipping switches or greasing rails or things like that. But what they got in return was much more significant, that the supporters of the railroad were literally beating people or forcing them out of their homes and confiscating their property, and all of this without warrants, arrest or search warrants, and then even killing a man. That kind of personal violence to me was so much more significant than the kind of petty property violence that was happening on the other side. And the fact that it was being all swept under the carpet by local governments made it even more hard for me to be sympathetic with the railroad supporters.
Hello, I'm Derek Cash with the North Little Rock Public Library System and want to welcome you to Meet the Author. Joining us today is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Central Arkansas and four-time J.G. Ragsdale Book Award winner, Kenneth C. Barnes, to discuss the fascinating and bloody history of the Missouri and North Arkansas Railroad strike and its violent conclusion with his most recent book, Mob Rule in the Ozarks, the Missouri and North Arkansas Railroad Strike, 1921 through 1923. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right. All right. Professor Barnes, why don't I just start off by having you introduce the reader? How did the strike begin?
Well, the strike began in February of 1921 when the railroad company slashed wages across the board for every employee by 20%, which is a pretty significant cut for anyone, who's, earning a wage. And it caused the workers to go off work thinking that, well, within a few weeks, maybe a month, they would be able to negotiate and bring things back to an acceptable agreement. But as it turned out, that didn't happen. The strike just dragged on for 2 years and then ultimately came to an end, not because of negotiations or any kind of compromise, but because of a mob action.
Yes, yes. There were so many parts of your book I just found fascinating. I could ask all day long, but we're limited in time. There was a character by the name of Charles Phelan. And I want you to, what did you think of him? Tell the reader or the listener who he was and what did you think of him?
Yeah, Charles Phelan was the general manager of the railroad when the strike began, and he just didn't have much of a empathy for his workers. He just sort of laid down the law. This is the way it is. Didn't really attempt to negotiate. He thought he had pretty much all the cards in his hands to play. But as it turned out, when the strike wasn't resolved and people didn't just, take the cut in wages, but kept the strike going and began to do some things like sabotage of some of the railroad property, and they began to lose money and even feared if the railroad might go under. He basically had a nervous breakdown and was released as the general manager. It's kind of an interesting and a bit of a curious story. He just left town abruptly and went to Canada and just disappeared from the record. I actually don't know what happened to him. He seemed to have deserted his wife and his children and just disappeared from the record. So I don't know what happened ultimately to
Yeah.
Charles Phelan, but he was definitely a failure in addressing the strike.
Yes. I mean, even though no one wants to be in that sort of position, and you could maybe feel sorry for him, my sympathies were very thin because of just, it seemed like cruelty or indifference combined with he just didn't know how to manage the people. Yeah. Or the workers or the strike. Yeah.
No,
Okay. All right.
exactly right on. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Something that really, well, I don't know why it should surprise me, but the KKK had a role in this strike. And it just, when I don't know why it should surprise me, but it did. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the role they played in the strike?
Sure. The time that this strike began was almost exactly when the Ku Klux Klan was arriving in Arkansas and throughout the South, and really just exploding with membership in every little town, like all the towns up and down the railroad. So it just happened to be the very moment that the strike's taking place. And the type of people who were members of the Ku Klux Klan were, in Arkansas especially, the community leaders, the
Mhm.
people who were like office holders in the city hall, county courthouse, or business people or professional people, lawyers, clergymen, teachers, physicians, and that sort of people. And they're the very sort who most had things to lose with the strike going on because they lost, their commercial interests were being damaged by the strike, slowing down the railroad, or in some points even shutting it down entirely. So members of the Klan organized, in chapters in these towns up and down the railroad, like Harrison, Leslie, Marshall, Heber Springs, Searcy, Eureka Springs, and so forth. Actually organized this mob action that brought the strike to an end. I wouldn't say that it was entirely a Klan event because they weren't robed when they came to Harrison and some of these other towns and enacted the violence that ended the strike. But it was pretty much planned by the Klan, and then many members of the mobs were actually Klansmen, as far as I know. Of course, it's hard to say with great certainty because the Klan was a secret society. So
Yes.
I don't know all the names of members of the Klan, but I do know some of them, and some of them made no secret of their Klan membership.
Mhm. Along those same lines, you may be aware of this. I think it was 1896. It may have been 1900. But when William McKinley was running for president in the state of Vermont, a lot of the factory owners told their employees, if McKinley is not elected, don't come to work tomorrow. And so you brought up in your book that M and NA employees received tickets or voters ballots or whatever that said you vote for Klan candidates, and if you don't, you'll be fired. So I mean, it goes to show American history is just the way the freedoms that we have today they didn't have back then, and it didn't surprise me, but it did surprise me.
Right. Yeah. No, that's certainly true.
Yeah. Could you tell us maybe a little bit, something else that's brought up is the fear of Bolshevism or communism in labor that played an effect in this strike and what was going on.
Yeah, that's a really good point. This moment in time was a time of the Red Scare, one of the Red Scares. There have been several in American history,
Mhm.
but at the end of the Russian Revolution, at the end of the First World War, was a time when, in the United States, people really were frightened that the labor movement had undertones of being a Marxist, a Bolshevik organization. In Arkansas, right at that time, I think it's 1917 or 18, the General Assembly actually passed an anarchy law that made it illegal for anyone to support Bolshevism in the state of Arkansas. So there was a lot of fear of that. And I think unions, took a hit because of it. Some of the unions in the United States, like the industrial workers of the world, really did have a real left-wing sort of red tendency to them, but the Railroad Brotherhood unions were just the opposite. They were very moderate, not at all Marxist, but yet I think the entire labor movement came under some criticism and suspicion just because of the sense that it might be a Bolshevik organization.
Well, I think, but with all these things that we've discussed so far, it 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 almost spells a recipe for disaster for the union, just the way people were thinking, what was going on in the world, in the country at the time. And so I'm glad you brought up this bigger fold or bigger let the reader know that it was more than just strictly a strike. There were outside people, groups that were affecting it. So thank you for that. Yes. Um, talk about Governor McCrae. It once again, I don't know why it should surprise me, but it irritated me that he did nothing to protect the strikers.
Yeah, that's indeed the case. He was very sympathetic with the railroad owners and
Mhm.
managers rather than the workers who were on strike. And McCrae himself, as far as I know, was not a member of the Klan, but the Klan had a great influence over his time as governor. His secretary was an influential member of the Little Rock Klan chapter. So the
Mhm.
Klan sort of had a plant in his office that fed him information and then shared information back to the Klan. So the governor of Arkansas, even though he had a role to play in the way things turned out, it certainly was not in any way supportive of the strikers and pretty consistently favoring the owners and the officers of the railroad.
I thought the story of Ed Gregor and his death was one of the saddest parts in the entire book. Would you talk about that just a little bit? And his widow, and just the whole thing, it was just so sad.
Right. Yeah, the strike ended really when the Klan organized this mob that arrived in Harrison, which was the headquarters of the railroad and where most of the strikers were living. And they basically just went on a reign of terror for about a week there in Harrison by going into the homes of strikers, taking them out, putting them on trial in sort of a kangaroo court, and requiring that they either tear up their union cards or leave Harrison or leave the state of Arkansas. Most of the strikers just went along with that and left. So it was sort of like an ethnic cleansing of sorts of strikers. But one of the strikers was less cooperative. When they arrived at his house, a mob of about 100 people outside his home, he went yelled out the front window saying, "Get out of my yard, or else I'm going to shoot you." And then apparently a shot was fired, and then these 100 men returned with a volley of gunfire that basically shot his house to shreds, and he was taken off to be put under on trial, although he had no had committed no crime, and as far as one knows, I had no reason to be punished for anything he had done. But in the evening of that first day, he was just carted off and hanged from the railroad trestle that's over the Crooked Creek on the south side of Harrison, sort of just as a symbol, I would say, for others that, if you don't cooperate, if you resist in any way, this is the kind of fate that would come to you.
It was like I said, it was just so tragic. I mean, the book has got a lot of sadness. That's not the best of words, but you know what I mean? It's just a lot of unhappiness, and it's just because you're just recording what had happened and interpreting it. But his death just struck out to me, it just got me right at the heart. And I know it's not a romantic story, but you did a good job of telling it accurately, but still bringing a little bit of a hurt to the reader. So thank you for it in a way for having to reveal something like that. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. Um, I think you bring up a lot about mobs, and I remember when I was in London, I think it was 1991, 92. I was near the British Museum, and there was a college students mostly, I think, they were marching. And I was on the sidewalk and I saw these students coming down the street. And when I was reading your book about the mob, it made me realize why police are hate mobs and they're terrified by them because you don't know, it just takes one spark and it could just turn into a great big riot, that sort of thing. And you did a good job of bringing up the mobs. And I could sort of live through that when I remember what I went through in London. Nothing happened. They were just marching down the street. But you do a good job of just talking about the mobs. And it can scare you're like you're living there. You're such a good historian, but also a good writer. So you did a good job for that. So thank you so much because it brought back those Proustian moments to me. So thank you so much for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. And this particular mob, I would say, was not. afraid of the mob because they were working with the mob. The policemen
Yeah, yeah.
actually is in league with the people that were in the mob, and so they had hands off, and the justice system really didn't prosecute them for lynching
Yeah,
Gregor
true.
or the stripping and the beating of several strikers and sympathizers of the strike.
Mhm. I think it was Reverend Ferris who said the boycott system contributed to dividing the towns, and it was just tragic to me what it really did. Discuss that. Tell the listener what that was all about. I just would hate to have lived back then and have to go through that boycott system.
Right. The businesses in the communities like Harrison took sides on the strike. And if some of them, if someone was a striker, then they could not, uh, they were boycotting, the strikers would boycott certain businesses that were favoring the railroad, and then vice versa. Railroad folks and supporters of the railroad would boycott certain businesses that did business with strikers. So it's sort of the idea of boycotts, either way it would go, divided in a very practical and real way on a daily basis the communities into one side or the other. And that sort of was just like a reminder of which side you're on, a sort of us and them kind of a situation.
Yeah. I don't, I'm not that old, but I'm not that young either. I've never lived in a situation like that. But I guess if you get people who are so, let's say, red or blue in America today, and if you happen to be the minority in that neighborhood, it could be pretty rough. But at least with businesses, they could probably keep you out. But we've got your whole book just made me realize how much to appreciate the freedoms and the rights that we have today that people in the 1920s just didn't seem to have, or they were just taken away from them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me read something from the book. I'm reading from page 106, and this is something that Reverend Ferris wrote. He said, Reverend Ferris noted that when strikers burned bridges, it was called arson, but when the mob burned Union property, it was called a bonfire. I was just wondering, as a historian, I mean, your goal is to be objective, but at the same point, you've got to have a point of writing the book, and you're probably going to take a side. I'm going to support the strikers when I write, or I'm going to support the railroad. And so, how difficult was it for you to try to remain objective, but try to keep your point at the same time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's one I labored over from the very beginning of the book because when I started the book, I felt like I was going to find fault on both sides with the strike.
Hmm.
It was going to be more a kind of everybody, had their deficiencies or their the faults about, how things played out. But as the process of researching and writing the book went on, I found myself more and more having sympathy with the strikers. I mean, they certainly did make some poor judgments at times, and that some of the strikers were participating in some acts of violence against
Hmm.
railroad property, like burning bridges
Yeah.
or flipping switches or greasing rails or things like that. But what they got in return was much more significant, that the supporters of the railroad were literally beating people or forcing them out of their homes and confiscating their property, and all of this without warrants, arrest or search warrants, and then even killing a man. That kind of personal violence to me was so much more significant than the kind of petty property violence that was happening on the other side. And the fact that it was being all swept under the carpet by local governments made it even more hard for me to be sympathetic with the railroad supporters.
Having said that, then, uh, in your research and more in your writing, was there anything you were disappointed with in terms of, I just can't find an answer to? Or is there anything like you had to rewrite the book? I would change this or alter this or anything like that?
Um, I've had such really good sources. I felt like I was able to really get down to the little details, the nitty gritty of what was happening. But ultimately, you don't know when you've got competing narratives, like you mentioned. Reverend Ferris, the Methodist preacher in Harrison, was a supporter of the strikers. The Presbyterian minister of Harrison was a supporter of the railroads, and they each wrote an account. So, competing accounts of what happened, and I had those as my sources, and many things in there. You just don't know where the truth would lie. So, there's always that one faces as a historian. You can't go in a time machine and go back and see it for yourself. So you just have to take what the evidence tells you.
Yes, and make a decision instead of straddling the fence. Yeah, okay, all right. Professor Barnes, this has been I completely enjoyed this. I've completely enjoyed having you as a guest. This is a wonderful book. I encourage people who are watching this program to get a copy and read it. But we want you, if people who are watching this program want to contact you, or if they want to buy a book, are you in social media? Where can they get a copy of this book?
Sure. Yeah, you can find me on Facebook, and then my email.
When you say Facebook, what's your name? And it's
Ken Barnes is what I'm under on Facebook. And then the UCA History Department website has my contact information, email address that I could be reached there. But the book's pretty widely available, Amazon, barnesandnoble.com. It's published by the University of Arkansas Press up in Fayetteville, so it's pretty easy to get your hands on it, especially online. I don't really know about the bookstores, how many of them are carrying it, but some of them are.
Okay, all right. Well, this has been a pleasure, and thank you so much once again for being on the program.
Well, thank you, Derek, for inviting me and your good questions.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining us today. If you're interested in reading Mob Rule in the Ozarks, you can check it out from the library or purchase it wherever books are sold. Also, you can find more information at the University of Arkansas Press at UAPRESS.com or at our website, NLRLibrary.org. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you again next time. Have a great day, everyone.